Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Jacqui Browne. I'm the independent chairperson of the Coalition of Disabled People's Organisations in Ireland. Tonight is our first information webinar, and it's an information webinar about the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It's a very exciting time for disabled people in Ireland because it's the first time the state has to report on its implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in Ireland. The Convention was ratified and agreed by Ireland in 2018. So this is the first time the state is reporting on its implementation around the Convention. The webinar tonight, we have two inputs for you. About the convention and about the consultation processes and how you can be involved in making submissions around the state's reports and indeed our own work later on after the state makes its report. And that's called, we, the DPO Coalition, will be doing what's called a shadow report, and we will tell you a little bit more about that later. Just to say to you before I introduce our two presenters, the DPO Coalition is made up of 6 national disabled people's organisations, and they are As I Am, who are the National Autism Advocacy Organisation, Disabled Women Ireland, the Independent Living Movement of Ireland, the Irish Deaf Society, the National Platform of Self-Advocates, and that's Ireland's only DPO run by people with learning disabilities. And our 6th member organisation is the Voice of Vision Impairment. So those 6 members participate actively in the DPO Coalition, and it's our pleasure to introduce you to our first webinar tonight. Our 2 speakers tonight will be, first of all, Alice Griffin, who's working with us as a project consultant, and Alice will give you an overview of the CRPD, that's the short version for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and including showing you a short video that explains the different articles in the Convention. And Alice will then talk about how the implementation is monitored in Ireland. Lucy Michael, Dr. Lucy Michael, who will be helping us with our shadow reporting process, will then discuss the draft state report and how people can feed into the draft state report. And she will also talk about the CRPD reporting cycle, how that happens from an UN perspective, and what happens with the state report once it's submitted, and about our role in developing a shadow report. Before I hand over to Lucy and to Alice, a couple of comments I would like to make is that the philosophy and the core philosophy of the Coalition of Disabled People's Organisation is the mantra, what is universally recognised now as nothing about us without us. In other words, disabled people are now and have reclaimed their rightful space in being centrepiece to everything around disability in their lives. The Convention itself obliges governments to meaningfully involve organisations and persons with disabilities through their respective organisations, such as our DPO, in all matters of concern to us. Article 4.3 of the Convention and General Comment number 7 are the key in requiring the active participation, consultation and involvement of organisations of persons with disabilities. General Comment 7 was developed by the UN CRPD Rights Committee as a result of many years of monitoring and reflecting on submissions of reports around the Convention from around the world. And the UN CRPD Committee felt it was necessary to further clarify what is meant by the participation of persons with disabilities, including children and women with disabilities, through their representative organisations in the implementation and the monitoring of the Convention. And just to tell you that this article states quite clearly that organisations of persons with disabilities should be distinguished from organisations for persons with disabilities. State parties should give particular importance to the views of persons with disabilities and ensure the priority is given to ascertaining their views in the decision-making processes. So these are the critical foundations of the work of the DPO Coalition. And we're very pleased to let you know our 6 organisations have come together with a view to being part of the state report. We're going to pull together our own submission and reply to the state report. And as part of that process, we are also working with the Disability Participation Consultation Network, which has been established by the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. So as part of that network, we will be making a submission to the state's initial draft report. And that consultation process closes on the 9th of April. And I'd like to emphasize for anyone listening tonight that anyone, any individual, any organization is quite welcome to make their own submission directly to the department before the 9th of April in response to the state's initial report. Following the state's submission of their first draft report to the UN CRPD Rights Committee, we will then review that report, go out for further consultation with our own members with a view to developing what we call a shadow report or an alternative report. So this is a report that is very important because this is the report where we will reflect the lived and real life experience of disabled people in Ireland and what they have to say about Ireland and its implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in Ireland. The DPO Coalition will be undertaking a series of consultation meetings, starting with our own steering group committee and with each of our 6 member organisations. That will happen over the month of February, early March. We will also be undertaking some questionnaires, and we will finally be doing very specific focus group meetings with particular groups of disabled people in Ireland. We're very conscious of making sure that we include the voice of children with disabilities, the voice of women with disabilities, the voice of people from different ethnic and diverse backgrounds. So we want to make sure that we can empower and involve as many disabled people as is possible in our shadow report. So the main thing for tonight is, don't forget, the 9th of April is the closing date for the state submission to the CRPD. And then about the following 3 months after the state, we expect the state will probably make their submission of the state report by the end of April, early May maybe, and roughly within 3 months, we will have our shadow report ready to go to the CRPD Rights Committee. And Lucy will explain to you what happens then at the UN CRPD level. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the 2 presentations. And thank you for being involved.
Thanks very much, Jacqui. Hello, everyone. My name is Alice Griffin, and I am working as project consultant to the DPO Coalition. So thank you for joining us today to hear about the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I'm going to be using a number of slides in my presentation. I will talk through these as I go along, and I will also give people time to read each slide before moving on. So I'm going to start with an overview of the Convention, looking at how disability is understood within the Convention and why it's important. Then I'm going to talk about the structure and the content of the Convention. This will be followed by a short video on specific articles with the Convention. And finally, I'm going to give you information on the monitoring implementation process, a general overview of how government reports to the United Nations on their obligations within the Convention and to whom. So let's start. What is the UN Convention about? Well, it's an international human rights treaty setting out what countries must do to make sure that disabled people can exercise their rights like everybody else. The convention is also called the CRPD, which is short for Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It was adopted by the UN in 2006 and ratified by Ireland in 2018. And just to remind everyone, when we say a country has ratified the convention, that means that they have officially joined the treaty and have made it part of their laws. So the convention ensures that the world's largest minority, people with experience of disability, can enjoy the same rights and opportunities as everybody else. It covers many areas where people have been discriminated against, including access to justice, participation in public and political life, education, employment, exploitation and violence, as well as freedom of movement. And the treaty is a treaty of many firsts. It is the first global human rights treaty of the 21st century. It is the first treaty ever to include disabled people in its negotiation and drafting, and it is the fastest negotiated treaty ever. So as I said, it was ratified by Ireland in 2018, and to date, 182 countries, along with the European Union, are part of the treaty. And that's another first. It is the first human rights treaty to be ratified by a regional international organisation, the European Union. The convention is now the global framework countries are using to develop disability-specific and inclusive policies and legislation. Let me say something about the active engagement and participation of people within the convention. The main message of the convention is that people are entitled to the full spectrum of human rights and fundamental freedoms without discrimination. To that end, the convention promotes active and full participation and engagement in all spheres of life. So not only does it identify people's rights, it clearly sets out what government must do to realize those rights, the economic, political, social, cultural, and civil rights, to challenge discrimination and promote full and active participation. So under the terms of the convention, states are obliged to consult with disabled people through their representative organisations when developing and implementing legislation and policies. Let's move on to the next slide, a shift in rights. So let's see how the convention marks a shift in attitudes and approaches to disabled people. The purpose. The purpose of the convention, which is laid out in Article 1, says it is to promote, protect and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all disabled people, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. So both Article 1 and the introductory statement to the Convention, which is known as the preamble, reaffirms the idea of human rights being universal and belonging to each human being. What's prominent here is the social model of disability, the idea that disability is not a medical construct. It is not a biological loss or a failure on the part of disabled people, but that disability is the result of individuals' interaction with barriers in society. So let's look at the concept of disability then in more detail. The Convention doesn't legally define disability. It states that disability is an evolving concept. Nevertheless, it does reflect this social model perspective of disability, as it clarifies that disability results from the interaction between people who have impairments and external barriers that hinder people's participation in society. And this is really, really important. The explicit and clear reference to barriers separate to an individual as a key factor in disability moves us away from notions of disability being equated with bodily or functional limitation. This is why the Convention is so important. Not only does it clarify people's rights and how those rights are to be realised, but it also embodies an attitudinal shift in how people are being perceived. Moving on to the next slide then. So, this understanding of disability, rooted in the social model, represents a moving away from considering people as objects of charity and pity by acknowledging that society itself is disabling. It represents a shift in perspective, where people are not viewed as objects of charity, medical treatment or social protection, but rather as subjects with rights, rights holders who are capable of claiming those rights, making decisions for their own lives, as well as being active members and contributors within society. So let's have a look at the key features of the Convention in terms of its structure and content. So there are 50 articles within the Convention, covering all sorts of different areas where people have historically been left out, including access to employment, education, participation in social and cultural recreation, and the right to live independently. And I'll come back to these in a moment. Another key feature of the Convention is that it is cross-disability in approach. What this means is it doesn't address any specific disability, but rather references all disabled people and their experience. There is a strong thread of non-discrimination and equality in the Convention. Essentially, the Convention is not introducing new rights, but rather establishing that disabled people have the rights to all existing rights without discrimination and on an equal basis with everyone else. There is a focus on full involvement of the disability community within the Convention. I mentioned earlier that this is the first convention where people were actively involved in its development, in its drafting. And this is reflected in the Convention. In Article 4, for example, there's a general obligation on states to actively consult with, interact and heed the advice of civil society groups, and in particular, DPOs, disabled people's organisations. We also see this in the monitoring provisions, which I'll be talking about later. The idea of nothing about us without us, this philosophy of disabled people being able to speak to what their lived experience is like, what their priorities and needs are, permeates the Convention and its implementation. And what's so important about the Convention is how it really creates change. It allows for change to happen through the implementation mechanisms. So first of all, we have what's known as the UN CRPD Committee, an expert committee in charge of monitoring the implementation of the Convention by the countries that have ratified it. And secondly, we have what's known as the Annual Conference of State Parties. This Conference of State Parties is the coming together of all ratified countries, in addition to the European Union, to discuss implementation of the Convention and share expertise. And obviously with the COVID-19 pandemic and restrictions, these meetings are now happening online. So I will be talking in more detail about the CRPD committee charged with monitoring implementation a little bit later. But let's have a quick look at the actual structure of the Convention. After this, we're going to watch a short video on specific articles within the Convention. So first of all, we have the preamble. And as I said, this is the introductory statement to the Convention. So this outlines certain principles, noting that disability is an evolving concept. It recognises the diversity of disabled people, the importance of autonomy and independence, and the freedom to make one's own choices. It also mentions a concern for multiple forms of discrimination and the importance of a gender perspective. The preamble then is followed by 50 articles. So Articles 1 and 2 define the purpose of the Convention and define who we mean when we refer to disabled people. Article 2 in particular outlines definitions used in the Convention, definitions related to communication, reasonable accommodation, universal design, and language and terminology. Article 3 then describes the 8 general principles that underpin the Convention, and these provide guidance to states on interpreting and implementing the Convention. And those 8 principles are as follows. First of all, we have respect for inherent dignity, individual autonomy, including the freedom to make one's own choices and independence of persons. Then we have non-discrimination, full and effective participation and inclusion in society, respect for difference and acceptance of disabled people as part of human diversity, equality of opportunity, equality between men and women, and finally, respect for the evolving capacity of disabled children and their rights to preserve their identities. So this article is very, very important in that it underpins all other articles in the Convention. Moving on to Article 4 then. Article 4 outlines the obligations of governments in respecting, protecting and fulfilling rights enshrined in the Convention. So governments are required to do this through their laws and policies, education and training and other actions. So it's hugely important. It's a hugely important article in that it requires government to involve disabled people and ask for their input when they make laws and policies. Article 5 then relates to equality and non-discrimination. Articles 6 and 7 recognise that certain people are exposed to discrimination, not only on the basis of disability, but also on the basis of gender, age, ethnicity, and other grounds. So there are two very specific articles within the Convention here for disabled women and for children. Articles 8 and 9 then relate to awareness, so that disabled people and non-disabled people understand their rights and responsibilities, and accessibility, which is fundamental to the enjoyment of all rights and to living independently. Articles 10 and 30 then define the rights of people and the obligations of state parties towards them. So specific rights included here include the right to live independently and be included in the community, that's Article 19, to personal mobility, Article 20, and to participation in political and public life, Articles 29. Then we have Articles 31 and 40, and these govern reporting and monitoring of the Convention by national human rights institutions, such as the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission and the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And finally, we have Articles 40 and 50, and they relate to both administrative and legal obligations on states. So I'll give you a moment to just read through those. Moving on then, we are going to look at specific articles within the conventions, and these are Articles 10 to 30. I'm going to play you a short video. It's about 8 minutes long, which explains these specific rights: civil, political, economic, social and cultural. The video was produced by the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. So the Commission is known as the independent mechanism within the Convention under Article 33. That is an independent organisation responsible for monitoring how the Convention is being put into practice and reporting to the UN on how well Ireland is doing this. So we're just going to play the video now.
The Articles of the Convention. Here is a list of the rights of the Convention. These are contained in sections known as Articles. Article 5. Equality and non-discrimination. This is about people being treated equally and protected from discrimination. This includes ensuring that reasonable accommodations are made when they are needed. Article 6. Women with disabilities. This is about women with disabilities being treated equally. Article 7. Children with disabilities. This is about children with disabilities being treated equally. Article 8. Awareness raising. This is about making everyone aware that people with disabilities have the same rights as everyone else. Article 9. Accessibility. This is about making sure that people with disabilities have better access to things in all areas of life, such as housing, transport, and information. Article 10. Right to life. This is about people with disabilities having a right to life on an equal basis as everyone else. Article 11. situations of risk and humanitarian emergencies. This is about ensuring that people with disabilities are properly protected when there are risky situations, such as flooding. Article 12. Equal recognition before the law. This is about being treated equally by the law. Article 13. Access to justice. This is about ensuring people with disabilities can get justice. Article 14. Liberty and security of the person. This is about making sure people with disabilities are free and safe, the same as everyone else. For example, not being deprived of their freedom just because they have a disability. Article 15. Freedom from torture or cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. This is about ensuring people with disabilities are not tortured or treated cruelly. Article 16. Freedom from exploitation, violence and abuse. This is about making sure that people with disabilities are protected from violence and abuse. Article 17. Protecting the integrity of the person. This is about treating people with disabilities as people first and respecting their minds and bodies in the same way as we should respect everyone. Article 18. Liberty of movement and nationality. This is about making sure that people with disabilities have a nationality and can get relevant documents such as a passport and are able to move between countries and live in different countries in the same way that other people can. Article 19. Living independently and being included in the community. This is about ensuring people with disabilities can live in and be part of the community and have the same choices as everyone else about where they live and who they live with. This includes making sure that the right services are available in the community to make this possible. Article 20. Personal mobility. This is about ensuring that people with disabilities can move around and be as independent as possible. This could include providing mobility aids. Article 21. Freedom of expression and opinion and access to information. This is about ensuring that people with disabilities can express their opinions and ideas and access information in various alternative or accessible formats. This includes accepting, facilitating and promoting the use of sign language. Article 22. Respect for privacy. This is about respecting and protecting privacy. For example, respecting privacy within family life or in correspondence such as letters. Article 23. Respect for home and the family. This is about making sure that people with disabilities have equal rights to marriage, a family and personal relationships. Article 24. Education. This is about ensuring that children with disabilities can have a high quality of education that helps them to reach their potential in the same way as all other children. Article 25. Health. This is about making sure people with disabilities can access high-quality health services and are treated the same way as everyone else in healthcare services. Article 26. Habilitation and rehabilitation. This is about ensuring that people with disabilities can live the most independent and healthy life possible, and providing support in health, work, education and social services to help make this happen. Article 27. Work and employment. This is about making sure that people with disabilities have the same chances to work as everyone else, and the same rights within work. This includes taking steps to help disabled people get and keep a job, such as making reasonable accommodations. Article 28. Adequate standard of living and social protection. This is about ensuring that people with disabilities have a decent standard of living, including food, clothing and housing, and can help to avoid poverty and improve their standard of living on an equal basis with others. Article 29. Participation in political and public life. This is about making sure people with disabilities can get involved with politics, including being able to vote, and have the opportunity to stand for elections. Article 30. Participation in cultural life, recreation, leisure and sport. This is about ensuring that people with disabilities have equal opportunities to take part in activities such as sports and visiting museums and other places of interest. It also includes having an equal right to identify in relation to language and culture, including sign languages.
Just to say, in relation to that short video, a guide has been produced by the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, along with the video, and is available from their website. You can download it from their website. So let's move on to monitoring implementation of the Convention. The Convention is very important and very clear on the role of disabled people and their representative organisations as active participants and partners in state action around disability. And this is especially so with regard to monitoring. So Article 33 makes clear that independent monitoring of the Convention's implementation must involve the direct participation of disabled people. According to Article 35, the preparation of reports should be open and transparent as an open and transparent process, and people, including children, should be consulted and actively involved through the representative organisations in the preparation of state party reports. And Lucy is going to talk about this a little bit later. So the philosophy, nothing about us without us, is deeply embedded within the convention. It's very clear that disabled people's organisations have an active role to play in the state party report. So let me just say something about how the monitoring process happens. So all states who've ratified the Convention are obliged to submit regular reports on how the rights in the Convention are being realised. The first report must be submitted within 2 years of ratification, and this is where Ireland is now. After that, a report will be submitted every 4 years. The UN treaty body set up to monitor implementation of the Convention is the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the UN Committee. So this is composed of 18 experts, independent experts, elected by countries who have ratified the Convention. They meet twice a year to review implementation of the Convention by examining each country's state party report. So what does this process look like? Well, the state party submits their report, as I said, within 2 years of ratification. The committee examines the report. The committee then prepares a list of issues and questions based on concerns raised by the report, which the state has to respond to. At the next stage, which is called a public hearing, the committee asks specific questions on the implementation of articles of the Convention, and the government must reply to this. Based on the state report, the reply to the list of questions, the public hearing, and additional information provided by DPOs, for example, and monitoring bodies through shadow reports, the committee then adopts what are known as concluding observations. So this is a document which assesses whether a country has respected or violated the rights of people as it was written in the Convention. It includes specific recommendations on actions that the country should take to ensure implementation. These are sent to the state and are also posted to the on the website of the committee. Following this, the state then is obliged to implement the recommendations. And DPOs in particular have a very important role in providing oversight to that implementation, in holding the state to account to ensure that those recommendations are implemented. So that's it. That's a general overview and introduction to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and how you can get involved. Lucy will take us through in more detail the reporting process next. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice. It's a pleasure to be able to describe to you now the way the consultations will happen this year, going towards the hearing of Ireland by the United Nations. On the screen in front of you is a comic cartoon displaying the many parts of the Convention. The Convention covers a very wide range of rights across a wide range of areas of life and the many responsibilities that the state has to fulfill those rights and allow them to be exercised freely and equally by disabled people in Ireland. The way that the United Nations will decide if Ireland is meeting its obligations under the CRPD, the Convention, is that they will hold a public hearing on Ireland's compliance with the Convention every 4 years. Ireland adopted the Convention 2 years ago and now makes its first report to the Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Because this is the first report, it will be a large one, and the job will be a little bit more difficult for others to make what are called alternative reports. Although the job is a large one, we should undertake it with enthusiasm. This is an opportunity to hold the state to account for its compliance with the Convention. The United Nations Committee will monitor the state's compliance at this upcoming meeting and again in 1 year's time to see if it has fulfilled its 1 year recommendations, and again 3 years after that as part of the normal 4-year reporting cycle. Let me talk you through the reporting process to the UN. The first thing that happens is that the state publishes a draft report. They hold public consultations. They're required to do this by the United Nations. And after those public consultations, they revise their draft report and submit it to the United Nations. The United Nations then has an opportunity to clarify any information in the report and seek additional information before the hearing. We expect the hearing to be held at the very end of 2021. Alongside the state report, the United Nations Committee will also consider alternative reports or shadow reports. And these are reports that are made by groups of NGOs, civil society organizations, human rights bodies, or other experts. Each of those can submit their own reports, although the United Nations Committee prefers that they are grouped, and they recommend state actions, either on the basis of things the state has said in its report, or things the state has not mentioned or misrepresented in its report. The state report is a very full document. The draft report in front of us at the moment is 62 pages long. That contains all of the policies in Ireland that pertain to or are relevant to disabled people, all of the practices in place that are to support disabled people and to help them to vindicate their own rights, the resources that are allocated to them, that's grants, investments and facilities, and the statistics on the current situation in Ireland. That might include, for example, how many disabled people are in education, accessing day services, using other facilities, or taking up any other kinds of supports offered by the state or its partners. Now, the Convention doesn't oblige the state to allocate any particular budgets or resources, but they're a way that the state shows that it's taking its obligations seriously. The state report addresses each of the Convention articles in turn. The articles refer to rights in each different area, for example, accessibility, education, healthcare, freedom from exploitation, liberty, decision making, and so on. So some issues will cross over those articles, and the state report repeats those issues in each section. So if it looks very large, there's good reason for that. If you want to make a comment on the state report, either in part or in full, you can do that in two ways. The first is that you can submit comments on the state report, in full or in part, before the 9th of April. The second thing you can do is you can take part in a public consultation event run by the state. Now, they will advertise those on the website that is made for the CRPD reporting process, and the DPO Coalition will share that link with you. But if you'd like to just Google CRPD Ireland, you should find it fairly quickly. So you can sign up to be notified of those public consultation events, and most organisations that support disabled people will be notified of them too, and will share those with their members or clients. So the DPO Coalition and other NGOs are not involved in running the state consultation, but they might contribute to it. And their contributions will change the nature of the final state report, hopefully improving the level of information provided, clarifying anything that the state has misrepresented or missed out. And that state report will be, again, a very full report. Now, there will then be a series of consultations by NGOs and human rights bodies in Ireland to provide that alternative picture to the UN committee, which they rely on in making their assessment of Ireland's compliance with its obligations. So, for example, the DPO Coalition will run a consultation that will include listening events to identify issues for particular attention and inform the consultation process. They will build a response to the state report, and they'll undertake a survey and focus groups to create their own draft shadow report, focusing on the issues that are of importance to their members. And that shadow report will be submitted in early autumn to the UN committee ahead of the hearing. Other organisations will also be running consultations like this, and each one will have its own approach. So you might get invitations from a variety of different organisations to contribute your thoughts to the process. And usually you can submit those in writing, and there's no limitation to the number of consultations you can send your comment to. So the last thing I want to show you is just a quick timeline so that you understand what this all looks like overall. At the top here, you can see 3 yellow boxes, and that is referring to the actions that the state is taking. That draft report, followed by public consultation, followed by the final report submitted to the UN. Below that, you can see in the orange boxes, the civil society group consultations, just like the DPO Coalition one, and the shadow reports that are sent to the UN. Sometimes there are up to 50 shadow reports, but the UN committee prefers that there are fewer so that they can concentrate on asking the state for the information that they need. When the United Nations Committee looks at the state report and shadow reports, they consider what recommendations they might make to the state. And at a public hearing, they can ask the state for its final information or thoughts on those recommendations or areas for action. Shortly after the public hearing, those recommendations are published, and then NGOs and human rights bodies can hold the state to account for following those recommendations. A year after the hearing, the United Nations Committee asks Ireland, the state, to report on what actions it has taken, and again, civil society, NGOs, and human rights bodies can hold the state to account for their compliance with those recommendations. After that, it's into the next 4-year reporting cycle, and we see the state back in front of the United Nations Committee in 2025. I hope that's made clear what happens with all of these consultations this year. There's lots of opportunity to have your voice heard, and don't be afraid to do that as many times as you see fit. Thank you.